the morning session, which will be a lecture. Afterwards, we're going again to our mixed groups. Each one knows his room. It's the same room of yesterday, and we'll continue our discussion, which started very nicely. So, first of all, I want to invite Professor Michael Pfoyer, and I will give you in short his bio. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages long. So I will make it shorter. He is the Dean of the Graduate School of Education and Human Development in George Washington University. And before he held other jobs, other duties, non-researchers. I think I will stop here. You'll be impressed. And we start going down to the nitty-gritty of the trust problem, and he will give us a lecture on accountability and trust. But I wouldn't let him go away without discussion. We have a commentator, Dr. వర్דה שיפר. She is the president of the Mendel Foundation, and I will invite them, both of them, to the podium, and from them they will have to manage by themselves their way. And if they don't manage, it's their responsibility. We trust you that you will do it. I finished my regulation. Okay.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Don. Pleasure to be here, and an even bigger pleasure to have such a short introduction. Shalom. It really is a great pleasure to be at this conference. I'm going without PowerPoint today, as my friend Virginia has pointed out. That's like walking on a tightrope without a net, so you'll pick me up if I fall. Let me start by thanking Ворדה and the conference organizers for inviting me, and also my dear friend Avital Darmon, who's not here this morning, but she was the one who made the connection and suggested that I try to get to Israel in time. I'm going to talk about accountability and trust. Having lived and studied and worked in Israel, I have great trust. You will hold me accountable for every word. So if you indulge me a little bit of nostalgia, I promise I will eventually get to the point. In any case, I will try to be brief no matter how long it takes. At my undergraduate institution, Queens College, established in 1937 and later integrated into the great City University of New York, lessons of accountability and trust were a central part of the informal curriculum. The president, when I was there, 1969 to 1973, although actually I was here in Jerusalem starting in 1972, he was a remarkable young man named Joseph Murphy. He had come to Queens College after writing his PhD under Herbert Marcuse at Brandeis, drafting speeches for the Kennedys, directing the Peace Corps in Ethiopia, all of that by the time he was 38 years old. I thought about his career. It always reminded me, some of you may know a famous mathematician and musician and poet named Tom Lehrer of that era, who once said, "It is a sobering thought that when Mozart was my age, he had been dead for 2 years." Now, don't let the name Murphy fool you. It sounds Irish, yes, but he grew up in a small house in New Jersey with his maternal grandparents, who were Eastern European Jews and who spoke only Yiddish at home. Joe counted Marx, Freud, and Einstein as his intellectual forebears. And though raised as a Roman Catholic, he was of course Jewish, at least according to our rules. What's more, he also became fluent in Yiddish, a talent he loved to exhibit, especially when visitors like the great actress Ida Kaminska came to campus. He tried some Yiddish with Ambassador Yitzhak Rabin. That didn't go over quite as well. The linguistic advantage came in very handy. On a visit to Israel in 1972, Joe had the pleasure of convincing a group of rabbis who had surrounded his car in Mea Shearim, which is a very ultra-Orthodox neighborhood of Jerusalem, and where you're not supposed to drive on the Sabbath. He convinced them to let him pass on the grounds that, after all, ich bin nicht a Yid. The rabbis were confronted there by something that I assume made them realize maybe something actually new was under the sun, and they convened a small caucus at the side of the road and contemplated what it meant that a Catholic named Murphy could speak such good Yiddish, and just because of how innovative this was, they let him go on his way. Joe applied his charismatic charm and his rare gift for politics to the management of an extraordinary institution. It had been invented to open the educational doors to masses of first-generation college-goers and first-generation Americans. The founding of Queens and CUNY, the City University of New York, tells a very important special story about the peculiar genius of American politics, and that is the insistence on matching grand rhetoric with practical action. If you think of Emma Lazarus's Huddled Masses, you will get a pretty good image of the students on my campus. CUNY stood for broad access and high standards, and the fact that these values were never viewed as incompatible are testament to what the great historian of American education, Lawrence Kremen, meant by our grand experiment. Making what eventually became known as a working-class Harvard was not a trivial task, but somehow it worked. Israeli Nobel laureate Robert Aumann, along with Jonas Salk, Kenneth Arrow, Leon Lederman, Colin Powell, who, by the way, is another Yiddish speaker, if you didn't know that, Andrew Grove, the founder of Intel, Paul Simon, the musician, Jerry Seinfeld, Irving Howe, Nathan Glazer, and Felix Frankfurter had all been students at CUNY at one time or another. Queens, like most campuses in the late 1960s, was mired in the struggles that made that period such a watershed. On American campuses, long before the word became fashionable, accountability was a dominant theme. I actually don't recall hearing the word much in those days, but in thinking back to how the students, faculty, and staff organized themselves, and I believe de Tocqueville would have been proud of our teach-ins and sit-ins and caravans to the Capitol, they were in fact trying to hold their government accountable for stagnation in the promised expansion of educational and economic opportunities for Black Americans, other minorities, and women, and for the horrible errors of our military intervention in the Vietnamese Civil War. Why it is that campuses become the locus of political protest, even when the grievances are primarily aimed not at College Hall, but rather at the halls of Congress, is an interesting question. I think you have the same situation here in Israel, where students are typically at the forefront of social movements and tent cities. I believe the reason has to do with the culture of academic life and the gift of free expression. Higher education builds tunnels to economic and social success, and they become conduits for the steady flow. Excuse me. It's inevitable, and I'm talking about free expression. And Higher education builds tunnels to economic and social success, and they become conduits for the steady flow of ideas between people and their governments. And when anger and frustration mount, the heat and the pressure test the resilience of those tunnel walls. Joe Murphy looked out his office window from the top floor of the administration building and observed somewhat ruefully, but with the fascination of an astute political theorist, one of the downside risks of all that academic freedom. He saw, I believe, what I later learned was an example of Garrett Hardin's famous tragedy of the commons. Freedom of expression had led to a proliferation of graffiti that may have seemed poetic to some, but was in fact considered by most of us an ugly campus blight. It was a classic example of how the pursuit of justly celebrated individual rights can lead to unintended social consequences. It is in some respects a problem of accountability, or the lack thereof. Here you had public monies collected via the traditional system of taxation, proceeds from which funded the construction of handsome new classroom buildings, theaters, and libraries. And then, without any enforceable accountability, with no formal mechanism to allow or curtail this behavior, individuals expressed undisciplined artistic license using the simple and cheap technology of pressurized paint sprayers purchased from local hardware stores. As anyone who had ever been a passenger on the New York City subway system would have advised, enforcing anti-graffiti ordinances was impractical, if not impossible. So if Joe Murphy was serious about curbing this negative effect of free expression, he would have to come up with something better, and he did. He declared the side of a large campus building open territory, and in a bold, innovative act, he invited students to write and draw and paint on that wall to their heart's content. This was an innovation that would have certainly thrilled our best behavioral economists. Just as we now know why competitive firms tend to locate near one another, think of intersections in most American cities where there are sometimes 3 or 4 competing gas stations. Joe's insight was that individuals seeking to maximize the power of their message might find it beneficial to co-locate, so to speak, rather than to isolate themselves in randomly selected sites across the campus. I bet you never thought that a wall of graffiti could become a primer on political economy. But Joe's mural offers a number of lessons about governance, about public goods, about externalities, about incentives, and unintended behavioral responses in authority, accountability relationships. But I mention the story for another reason, too, more germane to our topic at this conference. On Murphy's wall, amid the many colorful and clever exhortations such as burn pot, not people, support our boys, bring them home, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? And then one, which was very important, abolish required courses now. There appeared one day an even simpler commandment scrawled in a large calligraphy that said, challenge authority. This was not exactly a new idea. In fact, it was probably as good an abbreviation of the Declaration of Independence as one could hope for with a spray can. If Rabbi Hillel had been asked to explain American democracy standing on one leg, he might very well have said, challenge authority, all the rest is commentary. Now go and paint. In any event, there was an air of exasperation about the phrase, as if the author had reviewed all the other entries on the wall and settled for a simple 2-word synthesis. It occurs to me in retrospect that the phrase is very powerful in the American context because of the meaning of the word challenge, or better yet, because of what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean overthrow, but rather expresses allegiance to a core principle of our democratic system. To challenge is, in essence, to hold accountable. Challenging the authorities requires them to present evidence that what they are doing is legitimate, and it assumes that they, the authorities, will be granted the opportunity to rise to that challenge and to prove the case. Let me go a little bit further in this deconstruction. The word challenge suggests contest. Think of challenge match in professional sports. And therefore it connotes adherence to rules that govern the process of the contest. If the authorities that are challenged lose the contest, then perhaps they have to leave office, although even that would take place in an orderly fashion governed by accepted rules of conduct codified in law. The notion is not, at least in the first instance, overthrow the system or its leaders. The idea rather is to trust the fundamental precepts of political culture and through a combination of persuasion and protest bring about policy reform and, if necessary, change of leadership. Now you'll notice I have slipped in another word here, and maybe I am romanticizing a slogan that is in fact more banal, but my sense is that challenge authority conveys an idea that accountability is intertwined with trust. We may not trust our leaders as we would our closest friends and family, but we do trust our system enough to believe that by holding our leaders accountable, we can effect change. This notion may help explain why people living under corrupt and opaque governments, who cannot rationally be expected to trust their regimes, also refrain from challenging them. The upshot is, in those situations, that the distance between the people living in those societies and their state authorities grows ever wider, which in turn further erodes the trust and leaves no outlet for accountability but turmoil and violence. Some of the neighbors in this region have considerable experience with this problem. I like to think of the connection between accountability and trust in terms of sequence. Ex ante, we entrust our leaders with significant authority to allocate our resources, send our children to war, educate our citizens, keep our air and water clean, protect us from external threats, and even, God willing, someday provide us all with a decent system of health insurance. Then, ex post, we try to prove that they are doing these things well, or we challenge them to prove they are doing these things well. And here again, the somewhat exceptional American approach is to juxtapose rhetoric and reality. It is not enough to say we trust our elected leaders in whom we have vested so much authority. We want evidence that they are performing as expected. I don't quote Ronald Reagan unless I really have to. But I do believe that his bumper sticker version of all of this, at least as it related to American-Soviet relations at the time, captured the gist of this, and he said, trust but verify. In other words, we trust our leaders, but we impose validation requirements that have over time become abridged and consolidated in this word accountability, which has both intuitive and operational significance. And by the way, the Israelis here will undoubtedly be impressed with Ronald Reagan's ability to borrow from the Hebrew idiom, kabdehu v'chadshehu, hashdehu, sorry, yeah, I messed that one up, kabdehu v'hashdehu, which is Hebrew for honor or trust, but suspect or verify. This is a topic for another lecture, but there is something here that suggests perhaps the great relationship between American Protestant Christian thinking and its Hebrew origins. Intuitively, accountability means that a condition for maintaining authority is the demonstration of how that authority is used. That makes eminent good sense. Operationally, however, the concept is devilishly complicated, and we devote substantial resources to the development of measures or criteria used to evaluate the degree to which authority is legitimately and effectively exercised. And here again the word trust comes in, because we have to trust those measures. I'll have more to say about that in a moment, but the point here is that finding trustworthy metrics is very important to reassure the public that they are getting the information they seek and that they are entitled to. Let me just digress again for one moment and return to Murphy's mural, because my memory of it evokes yet another connection to accountability, especially as it relates to education. The day after someone had painted "Challenge Authority," there appeared a very witty and world-wise rejoinder. Someone had come along during the night and added underneath, "Says who?" Now, later I was reminded of this very lovely exchange when I read of an incident at a major conference of philosophers and logicians. Apparently there was a somewhat pompous linguist who had been arguing with great certainty and confidence that while in many languages two negatives make an affirmative, there was no known language in which two affirmatives make a negative. Hearing this, the legendary Sidney Morgenbesser, in the audience, retaliated with a very nicely audible, "Yeah, yeah." It took just two little words to bring the house down. In any event, the dialogue on the wall for me has always been a poignant metaphor of what is great and also what is very frustrating about the American education system. As anyone who has worked there will attest, a big problem with our preference for decentralized decision-making is not the lack of expertise, but rather its oversupply. For every proposed reform in curriculum or pedagogy or school management, there arise critics whose first question is essentially, "Says who?" And the school system we have there, like those in all countries, reflects to some extent the broader political culture, which in the American case is heavily dominated by an allergy to central authority, a penchant for practicality, skepticism even about the authoritativeness of science, and a belief in the virtues of local community. Not coincidentally, the founding norms of the new republic. The history, of course, is more complicated. Local decision-making, which did enable our school system to become agile and adaptable to change, was also responsible for the ugliest episodes of racism and legalized segregation, protected under the veneer of states' rights. And it is not surprising that it took about 214 years for the United States to adopt a set of national education goals. This is a political miracle that happened amid a great big battle. On one side were the visionaries who worried that our national standing in the world would be eroded if children in Montana and children in Florida learned different mathematics. On the other side stood visionaries who believed that our economic progress through much of the 20th century was partly the result of an approach that privileged local innovation over centralized governance. Former president of Harvard, James Conant, once observed that we don't really have an education system. We have a hodgepodge, and we seem to like it that way. Another Harvard scholar, more recently the political scientist Richard Elmore, has argued that we shouldn't like it that way. Our persistent and vexing inequality of educational outcomes is due in part, in Dick Elmore's words, to our fetish for local control. That is, our preference that decisions about content and governance of schooling be handled by 15,000 local school boards first, their elected state officials second, and trailing at a very distant third, the politicians and bureaucrats who work in Washington. Although other countries, I know Germany for example, have decentralized school systems, the U.S. is exceptional. I remember being at a meeting at the National Academy of Sciences, probably around 1995, when the French Minister of Education and his entourage and a handful of high-level American educators and policymakers gathered in the boardroom, Minister Allègre, himself a distinguished scientist, reported that the decision had been made to adopt the quote-unquote hands-on science curriculum, and that by the following week, all schools in France were beginning to implement it. The Americans in the room salivated with envy. Allègre observed that and added with an air of anxious prescience that when power is concentrated, so is opposition. He was onto something. 6 months later, he had been ousted by a well-organized campaign among teachers who resented his suggestion that more time in the holy days of summer should be devoted to professional development. Le mois d'août, pas possible. So, in my remaining time, which is, fortunately for you, dwindling, I want to focus on 2 reasons why educational accountability is so challenging. First, in the U.S. today, perhaps more than elsewhere, widespread anxiety about the condition of education and its effects on economic productivity and competitiveness has been translated into rigorous and, to many observers, unfair and ineffective efforts to hold teachers accountable for their students' academic performance. Unlike those situations in which accountability means challenging the authority of the ruling elites, this strategy targets a large professional class of people who are essentially employees of the state. Crudely speaking, the traditional model in which students and workers rise up to criticize their leaders is inverted. We now have powerful elected officials joined by corporate and foundation executives holding working teachers and their students accountable. Now, if this sounds like a radical departure from historical traditions and democratic norms, I would argue that in fact it is not. The accountability movement rests on the proposition that teachers actually do have substantial authority in their classrooms, and that having entrusted them with the education of our children, we are entitled to evidence that they are performing according to expectation. This is not new. We have always demanded of our teachers, at least since the days of the common school reforms in the 19th century, and we have always insisted on evidence of basic principles of equity as they have evolved and quality in the education of our kids. What's different today is the increased role of the federal government in setting standards and flexing its political and economic muscle. But even this shift, and remember our Constitution specifies that education is essentially not a federal responsibility, fits with the political culture. To the extent that our elected officials are supposed to represent society's aggregated preferences, then bringing the power of the state or the government to bear on teachers and teaching is exactly why we have government in the first place. In other words, and ignoring just for a moment the possible excesses in the way the concept is implemented, holding teachers accountable is compatible with notions of countervailing authority and the balancing of coercive power. I would add that many liberal supporters of the new federal role have history on their side. Memories of states' rights applied to the denial of civil rights are still fresh and raw. On the other hand, critics of this new accountability movement, who rightly worry about the effects of all this pressure on the morale of working teachers, often argue that if we only trusted our teachers more, they would be able to do a better job. This sounds very nice, but misses the point. Accountability in American democracy is in fact all about trust, but it is trust subject to checks and balances. We want to trust that teachers will work hard on behalf of the kids, but we maintain the right to check on their performance, just as we trust police officers to handle crime, but we hold them accountable for process and results. In the case of teachers, we try to balance professional norms, that is, their rights to work in classrooms, with our rights as citizens and parents to know how the kids are doing. It's a complicated dance, requiring agile choreography, and it's no wonder we have been experimenting with different techniques for more than 2 centuries and haven't yet settled on an optimal solution. Which brings me to the second big challenge, namely finding the techniques to implement these very principled goals of accountability. So let's assume that we agree on the basic idea that the general public, through its elected governments, has a legitimate appetite for evidence that funds are spent wisely and that schools are teaching effectively. The devil is in the evidence. What measures shall we use? Now, the most intuitively attractive measures are those derived from standardized tests. Americans love numbers. Just open the sports section of any newspaper, and test scores seem to provide at least a crude approximation of the performance of students and the effectiveness of teachers. A century of investment in the science of measurement has resulted in great progress in the validity and fairness of inferences derived from test scores, but scores are always just estimates based on a statistical sampling of complex domains, and as any respectable psychometrician will attest, the estimates come with non-trivial error terms. Over time, and despite the periodic outcry of the professional measurement community itself, policymakers have tended to ignore the error term. They have been swayed by the increasingly scientific nature or appearance of testing, have developed exaggerated notions of the precision of the measures, and have come to rely heavily on tests for too many purposes. Worst of all, by attaching so-called high-stakes consequences to test results, reformers with good intentions have unwittingly created incentives for gaming of the system and the distraction of students from mastering the relevant material. Practicing test-taking supplants genuine learning of the material that the tests are supposed to measure. And the approximations therefore get cruder, to the point where we no longer have much confidence in their validity. Remember, the basic question is, how are our kids doing? And that's a legitimate expression of our accountability rights. If the answer is blurred and misleading, untrustworthy, we feel cheated, or at least uncomfortable. And the plot thickens. For not only does excessive use of tests lead to public confusion, it saps the morale and effectiveness of the very professionals in whom we have entrusted the education of our children. According to recent polling data, morale of teachers in the United States has hit an all-time low. In part, I would argue, because of an accountability system that seems to have run amok. James March may have been right when he warned that the demand for accountability is a sign of pathology in the social system. Now, thinking back to that wall of graffiti, I think today our attitude to teachers would translate to the word trust in very small letters and the word verify in very big, bold strokes. Sadly, I think today the rebuttal underneath would probably say, the beatings will stop when the morale improves. Biting sarcasm aside, is it any wonder that we have been hearing calls to hold the accountability system accountable? As I write, petitions are circulating for an end to all this testing. And our political leaders and their advisors might very well want to have a chat with former Minister Claude Allega. Let me recapitulate and close on a note of cautious optimism. Jim March's wisdom notwithstanding, I believe that demand for accountability is not always a sign of pathology, but is actually a sign of robust democracy in action. And we wouldn't be demanding accountability if we didn't trust it could lead to positive change. We have made substantial progress in turning democratic ideals into practice, And as flawed as the current system may be, I worry that the alternatives, turning everything over to the miracles of the market, or appointing an education czar to dictate benevolently from Washington, are neither likely nor appealing. We need rather to set our sights on a modestly paced set of improvements, both in our accountability system and in our education system, and resist the temptation for quick fixes. Understanding the origins and context of accountability, restoring trust in its methods and metrics, monitoring our progress, and investing in continuous improvement should be the pillars of our educational strategy. Otherwise, I suspect our attitude will be expressed sarcastically in graffiti on that wall that says, "Mission accomplished." And we know how successful that was. Thank you very much, and glad to take questions.
Thank you very much. You've made my job here a bit difficult this morning, I'm afraid, for two reasons. About 2/3 of your lecture, I think, is a fairly strong statement for holding teachers and the educational professionals accountable. And I think you make a very convincing case of it. But then at the last third, you sort of switched a little bit back and you qualified what you said. But I think I'm going to not disregard this qualification, but to say that it is based on quantity. And I'm going to speak perhaps a little bit about the quality. The other problem I have is your absolutely artful way of using the word trust, which is we cannot actually translate into Hebrew at all. And I'll just point out one thing. You said that we entrust the teachers with the job of taking care of our children. I think that we, at least here in Israel, would never be able to actually construct a sentence like that, and therefore we would say that we appoint or we choose teachers as professionals to do a job that we have to do, and that of course changes the relationship. So what I want to do is to try and link some of the points that you made with some of the issues that were raised yesterday. I think your first part with the emphasis on the need for accountability and the right to hold teachers accountable evokes one of the questions that was sort of briefly raised by our colleague from California about why do we need trust at all? I mean, we can live without trusting. We can measure, we can hold accountable, we can appoint the best people. I mean, what does it have to do with trust? And the fact is, I think, as far as I can see in the literature, that the only part of trust in education that everybody agrees on is that children have a better chance to exhaust their abilities and to flourish if teachers and their parents have trust in their ability to do so. I think that's what research tells us about the link between education and trust. All the rest is questionable. I mean, do the authorities, the decision makers need to trust teachers? No, they need to choose the best qualified people, give them perhaps good directions, regulations, and test them afterwards. I mean, how does the word trust enter into this? And I think perhaps we need a slightly better theory about the idea of having trust. It's a sort of a positive way. We like having trust, and I think another thing which is probably agreed upon is that it's a sort of a lubricant that makes it possible to reach compromises, and compromises are extremely important in any sort of relationship, and especially in our context here between politicians dealing with education and educational professionals. But I think there is a slight problem with our theory, and I think we need to work more about the theory of how trust in the system, in its entire complexity and its multifaceted nature, really influences the quality of education and the chances of our children. I think we still have a slight problem there. But I will assume that if we have trust, it's certainly much more pleasant to work in an environment where you have trust. And as I said, it makes it easier to reach compromises. So that's one point, which of course, it opens many more questions, and it's not an answer in any way. The next point is that, as I said, I think you reduced a little bit the professional side or the professional claims of the education professionals. I'm quoting you. You said, in the case of teachers, we try to balance professional norms, i.e., their, meaning the teachers, rights to work in their classroom. So I think this is really, a very, very narrow side of it. And if you do describe the professional side of the teachers as the right to work in the classroom, then it's much easier to go into measures of accountability that deal with metrics and with testing, etc. I think that educational professionals perceive their profession as focused primarily on process, and I think we saw it yesterday. They see it as dialogical, interactive, as multifaceted, and as influencing not only the knowledge that you can measure and perhaps even the understanding, but also the behavior, values, emotions, and commitments, a variety of outcomes of education that they question whether they actually can be measured in the ways that even you said, perhaps we have overdone it with measuring that. More so, as professionals, they believe that their ability to actually carry out their mission in the best professional way has a lot to do with autonomy. You used the word authority, and I think, again, I can't say anything rational about why it disturbed me, but in a way it disturbed me because I'm not sure how much authority teachers really feel that they have, but I think they do feel that they need autonomy in order to carry out their professionalism in their activity. And certainly autonomy requires trust on the side of whoever appoints them, or as you said, entrust them. So that is, I think, the side of the teachers and the way they see the professional, and I think then it makes it a bit more difficult to argue for the way you thought they should be held accountable. Another point which you very briefly mentioned, and I want to say something about it, is where do these methods of accountability or the way that teachers are being asked to account for what they're doing in terms of measuring results, testing, evaluating performance, all these words. And I think that they come from the business world. And I think these are terms from the business world. And I think it's linked to something that you did mention, and that is the influence of the global economy and economy in general on the objectives of education today. And we very easily can say, well, the state wants people to be educated because it wants to be an active partner in global economy, and for the sake of global economy we need graduates of schools who know A, B, C, D. And I think we have a term now for that, and the term is managerialism. And this term is very threatening, I think, from the point of view of the educational professionals. They perceive it to be completely alien to their profession. It's like two concepts, one of our profession of being sort of soft, of affecting the minds, the hearts, the beliefs of children, and coming with, you know, these hard kind of facts and knowledge. And here there is this need to balance, as you said, or to dance, this complex dance, which requires agile choreography. And I certainly agree with the sentence, but I'm not sure that what happens now is really accommodating to this, the delicacy of the situation. And I'll come back and I'll say that in a trusting environment, it will probably be easier to reach these compromises and to work out the balance in a much better way. And I think that where we got to with the heavy emphasis on metrics, it means that the balance here shifted, you know, in a dangerous way. My last point has to do with the nature of trust, which I think that was mentioned yesterday, and you in your talk alluded to many times, and that has to do with the link between trust and national or political culture. And I think there is a link like that, and of course the literature says that there is a link like that, but I'm a little bit worried about overemphasizing it because it implies that perhaps it's extremely difficult or even impossible to change it because, you know, national culture, political culture, that's who we are, and we are trusting or we are not trusting. And if we still think that trust is a notion, a value worth investing in, then to say that it is too strongly linked to some sort of a national culture, I think is a problem. The literature tells us that it's much more tightly linked to economic inequality and to general inequality in society and to rifts between groups within society, and that it actually can be remedied. And one of the problems we have with trust is that we have very weak theories, causal theories. We don't know what affects what. I mean, some people say, well, if you were in a participatory society, then you generate more trust. But then when there is trust, there is a more participatory society, and it's very circular. And but this circular notion also means, as Putnam tells us, that there are environments that create virtuous cycles, and there are environments that create vicious cycles, and that it nurtures itself. And I think yesterday we heard from the Japanese and we heard from the Finnish cases where you can see that incidents that perhaps in Israel would ruin the trust of policymakers in the educational profession, in an environment which nurtures trust, you very easily, you know, come over it, because the whole attitude is an attitude that creates this virtuous cycle. And I think that it's more important to think, it's at least for me as an activist, it's I would like to think in that way. We can begin the cycle anywhere. We have to start doing it. We cannot say, well, this is the situation, that government doesn't issue policies, and as long as this and this is not going to happen, we cannot change this and this. At any point of this cycle, which has to do with the responsibility of the teachers, the ability, leadership ability of principals, the commitment that they have towards the school, the commitment that they have towards the need of policymakers to be accountable to the general public, and of course from the side of the policymakers, you can start it anywhere and create this virtuous cycle that will make our life, I think, a little bit more pleasant. Thank you.
Well, you've heard enough from me, so why don't we have comments and conversation? Is this on?
I can stop. Anat, please.
wanted to ask Michael, following your analysis, what should we do in the meantime? What do I mean in the meantime? You made a very convincing case for the theoretical basis of accountability and why we should strive for it. On the other hand, the practical world shows us that things are very far from the way we would have liked to see them. And there are theoretical ways, and we know today the advancement in assessment, in multiple ways of assessment, qualitative assessment, and so on. We know how theoretically we could make it work. But in today's world, with budget constraints and political issues, it just doesn't happen yet. So what in the meantime, when we have this clash of theoretical issues on the one hand and then the practical world on the other hand, what should we do meanwhile?
When I was a kid, is this on? Yeah, when I was a child, my father once said, so suppose you're in a boat with your parents, and the boat is going to capsize, and you can only... No, sorry, I have to start over. Suppose you're dreaming that you're in a boat. Okay, so now you know, I messed it up. And you can only save one of your parents. What do you do? And I was a little boy. I thought, I don't know what I would do, Dad. And he said, well, you should just wake up. If you're wondering about my strange way of thinking of the world, it's all related to that joke. I don't really have a good answer to that. I think you're right, though, that there is some hope, at least in the U.S., there is some hope that I think springs from what we're now calling this Common Core standards movement, which is in some ways maybe not happening quickly enough for some people, or maybe it's happening too quickly for others. But it does represent something which, you know, as much as I agree with Varda that if you take this political culture thing too far, you end up saying nothing can ever change, I think there is evidence that things actually are changing. And we now have 47, 45 states that have pretty much voluntarily signed up for an approach to reform and educational improvement that, at least in a crude approximation, represents a compromise between the virtues of some kind of authoritative decision as to what should be taught and how, and the instincts that the states and the localities should still have a lot of the prerogative about deciding how to do it. In the meantime, the assault on teachers is continuing with great aggressivity. And so if it were up to me, you ask me what we should do, I think we should calm down, frankly. And I think we as an education research community have an obligation to press back against these kinds of assaults on teachers with evidence, with data. I mean, I don't have any other tools. I'm not a politician. You know, the best I can hope for from my little corner of the world is to try to provide some systematic evidence that counters some of the claims and the underlying propositions that are being so casually but very destructively have become so much part of the discourse. So that's, I think, it's just, but in doing that, you know, I mean, the problem is that one has to have a sense of delayed gratification. This is going to take a while, and mercifully, cognitive science tells us that delayed gratification is a symptom of an advanced intellectual capacity. So I'm not worried, I suppose. But I mean, there is a delay here, and we're going to have to just, you know, keep going. The third thing, which I agree with you, what you said, Anat, is about technology. I think that's what you were getting at. And there is progress in the world of assessment and in finding metrics that actually do a better job of approximating the things that we really value. Now, here you have, we don't have time for a whole history of educational testing, but one of the biggest problems was the pursuit of measures in a system that was oriented to mass public education. And the economics of providing at an individual level the kind of really nuanced understanding of children's development and cognitive functioning and capacity, the economics were just impossible, whether you like it or not. And that's why we settled for these very rough estimates of basic skills, about which most people could agree, and psychometrics got better at that. Today you do have investments in new technologies of measurement that take advantage of high-speed computing, even of magnetic resonance imaging, of all kinds of other technologies that could actually do a better job in providing proxies for what we value without as much sacrifice as we currently are experiencing. So there is some hope in that. And other than that, I say just keep on pressing for more and more rationality in the way this debate evolves.
I would like to add something from a completely different angle to what Michael has just said. What we keep hearing all the time is a wish of all sides to engage all stakeholders in decision making, in thinking about issues. And I think that if we look into what is actually happening and we speak to people, we hear them say, we were not asked, we were not engaged. Policymakers tell us, well, we tried to engage, or we did engage, we spoke with the intermediate organizations, they had representatives. I don't think that we invest, the slightest portion in thinking about how to create these mechanisms in environments where you don't have the hierarchical structures any longer to create the agreements. We have less agreement, we have more diverse societies, we don't have the hierarchical structures, and we do not invest in thinking about how to go about this engagement process. And we keep hearing about it all the time. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of investment going on into finding the metrics, into how to evaluate. But the one thing that we keep hearing is the need to engage everyone, the need to bring everyone to the table. Now, it sounds very nice, but it's not a question of a table and 20 people sitting around it. It's much more complex. There's a little bit here about deliberative democracy, a little bit there about large group, I don't even remember how it's called, large group methods, but it's just the beginning. These things don't work. I think there should be more investment in thinking about how do we engage the stakeholders. There was somebody there.
And by the way, while we're investing in mechanisms to encourage more public forum and deliberation and engagement, there are communities which are in a much more, in a condition of emergency, for which very nice theoretical arguments about the importance of engagement and patience and what I was saying, delayed gratification, are not going to be very well received. There is another generation, at least in the U.S., of kids who are going to be lost if something isn't done to improve the quality of the education they're getting. And I don't have it in me to approach the parents in those communities and say, please, you have to be patient. We're working on this. This is the fundamental crisis. And in the U.S., I can say, speaking mainly just for myself, I don't think the crisis is that we don't know how to do good teaching. I think the crisis is that if you fly over the United States of America and you fall out of a plane, God forbid, you have a 50% chance of landing in one of the best schools in the world and 50% chance of landing in one of the worst, and there's a pretty good chance that they'll be within a few blocks of each other. That's the crisis. And I can't go before communities of poor black or Latino kids and their families and say, look, we're working on it, which is essentially what I have. I have nothing else I can tell them, that we are working on it. But this idea of, and this is where the trust thing becomes very significant, because I can't expect them to trust a system that has been so dramatically underachieving for them. How much more trust can we get out of these people? So anyway, that's the predicament, that we've got an emergency on our hands, and the methods that we want to develop require deliberation and patience. And if you're wondering why we have fights about accountability, that's my sense of it. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you very much.